Okay, so the first question, looks like no one's got any questions from the first two chapters, so we're going to jump to distribution. And the question is, hi Steph, I've only recently started my blog. I do have an audience though, because I've been writing directly on Facebook. Now I'm a bit confused. Should I keep posting the full articles on Facebook or only on the new blog? People are used to reading me on Facebook, but on my blog, I can write longer articles and build my SEO. So this relates to kind of the example that I give in the book, which is Medium, but it can apply to other channels, which is that yes, you should be posting first on something that you own, which would be your blog, right? So your site, that's the canonical, the first iteration of that. And to your point, you can write as long of a post as you want. Typically, also when you're writing on your own blog, if you're using something like a Ghost or a WordPress versus a Facebook, it's also a lot more dynamic. You can insert things like GIFs. You can just honestly create the article that you want to create. So once you've done that, you publish it. Hopefully, if you have read the SEO section, you also optimize it for SEO if appropriate. Then once you have that canonical article, you can distribute it in other places. You can post the full article on Medium. You can take pieces of it and tweet about them. You can take large chunks and still post them on Facebook the same way that you're doing now. So you still have access to your Facebook audience. Or in my case, for example, I still have access to my Twitter audience, or other people, again, have access to their Medium audience. But you're getting the benefit of one, owning your content, two, building a distribution engine around that content, as in like a newsletter or something that you own, right? Because if Facebook ever chose to shut you off, or as they've done in the past, not just shut you off, but like adjust the algorithm so that you can no longer access your audience, then you're not in such a good spot. So you want to build something that you own, and then from there you can distribute it, and you should distribute it through all of these other means. So I'm not sure who asked that question, but hopefully that answers it. If not, feel free to post in the chat or go off mute and clarify if I missed anything. But yes, that's what I would encourage people to do, is to publish first on their own site and then distribute it elsewhere. Okay, we'll move on to the next question, which is about SEO. So I work with clients who use software in Squarespace, and I know the SEO is not great. One workaround I've been seeing is making a subfolder for your blog and hosting the blog on Cloudflare and Superblogger or WordPress. Curious your thoughts on this approach. I'm also pretty confused on how to set this up accurately so the homepage stays that and the SEO juice from the subfolder blog carries over. No need to apologize on the wordiness. Yes, so actually this is exactly what I do. So if you guys see here, my site, this is called a subdomain. You guys can see this in the URL. It's blog.stephsmith.io. It lives on the same domain. There's some controversy from Google, but one thing to keep in mind is you will never be absolutely certain about anything unless someone from Google, which they very rarely do, comes out and says, like, this is how we design our algorithm. And so everything that you hear about whether .coms matter or how important domains are versus subdomains are people positing, some people trying to look at different data. But at the end of the day, from what I've seen and what I've read about, again, you may find some conflicting opinions, is that basically a domain and a subdomain, the subdomain will basically be equivalent to the domain in terms of passing that link juice. And you don't have to worry about it. There's nothing that you necessarily need to set up other than, of course, making sure that the SEO on your subdomain is still good, but you don't have to like send a note to Google or do anything in particular to say, hey, Google, this subdomain is meant to be part of this original domain, because it is, Google treats that subdomain as part of the domain just from the get-go. And so this is exactly what I did. And, the alternative, of course, what you'll see in many blogs is like, you would have stephsmith.io/blog/the articles, right? And again, you can look up different articles on this, and some may differ, but for the most part, from what I've seen, they are equivalent, right? So blog.stephsmith.io would pass on the same link juice as stephsmith.io/blog. And so for that reason, I personally found it much easier to set up the subdomain and just orient everything around that, because to your point, I use Ghost, right? And Ghost is specifically meant for blogging, but Ghost doesn't really have the functionality I want for my homepage, for example. So if I go to stephsmith.io, this is actually self-coded and hosted elsewhere. And so they're two different entities that I manage, but I actually prefer that because, again, if you're using something like Squarespace, it's really, really good for certain things, but really, really terrible for other things. And so my opinion is that you shouldn't go for one thing that fits all. You should find the solutions, you know, within reason. So you're not using 8 different solutions, but within reason, find something that works really well for blogging, and then something that works really well for, you know, your other stuff, which tends to be more like landing pages. There's my modal popped up. And so, yes, I would encourage you to do that. Now, when it comes to actually setting this up, it definitely depends on what you're using to set it up. But what it's going to look like is you're going to be setting up different DNS records. So when you have your Squarespace account, you can link that directly to your domain, as you're already doing. And then when you set up something like Ghost, there's going to be a process where, as you're setting up those Ghost records, you're connecting it to a domain. Instead of connecting it to your main domain, you're going to connect it to, like, for example, blog.stephsmith.io, and you're just going to have to set up those DNS records. So for example, in Cloudflare, the same way you'll have like different A records for @ which is just the root, you would set up a different A record for blog dot whatever you're doing, or you could call it, you know, whatever you want, articles dot something. But that's what I would recommend. If you have any questions, I can follow up on specifics after. I just assume that that's not going to be super helpful for everyone. But yes, you would set up the domain, the subdomain in your particular blogging platform. And then if you're using Cloudflare, it should be really easy to set it up. And if you're curious, even if you don't end up using Ghost, you can probably use some of the, some of the learnings from this article, the one about Ghost, because you can see here the DNS records that you have to set up. And this is what it looks like in Cloudflare. Remember, I said that A record, there's a blog metric, and it's pointing to a specific IP, right? Which is being hosted or connected through Ghost in this case, but you could do it through other blogging platforms. So that's what I would recommend, especially if you already are using something like a Squarespace, which is really, really not great for articles. Do I have a question? I can see, I'm just going to mute someone unless they have a question, but yeah, okay, so hopefully that's helpful. I'm going to go back up here just because someone added it and it directly relates to what I was just talking about. Ghost as a newsletter sending platform, since you can get the benefit of hosting your newsletter on your own domain, with a caveat, of course, that platforms don't matter if I'm not actually writing anything. Yes, so I think I mentioned this in one of the sections that across the spectrum of the different kinds of software that you'll be using, or the different tools, the ESP is one that, from my experience, most of them are fine, right? So there's different things that you might care about. Certain ones are much more expensive than others. I certainly wouldn't go with a completely unknown one, because they're sending score, or like they're almost the equivalent of like domain authority, but for servers, right, that they're sending through may not be very good. But if you're using a MailChimp or a Ghost or a ConvertKit, or I can probably name off several others, Email Octopus, they're all fine, right? So as long as you're using, I think, something that's relatively well known, you can use whatever you want. The benefit of using Ghost, if you're using it for your blog already, is yes, that ease where you just click a button and it's automatically sending. But tons of people, including myself, use a combination of a blogging platform and a different ESP, right? So I would say the main thing to consider here is just the friction, right? So if you really care a lot about, I want this to be as low friction as possible, which is why a lot of people go to Substack, the Ghost combo is kind of like a replacement to Substack that's open source and that you own. And so, yes, I think that's a totally fine option. But if you want a little more customizability, then you could do like Ghost for your blogging, but then still connect it to something like a MailChimp or a ConvertKit. Because something to keep in mind is, I've said this over and over, and in the past it's been to Ghost's benefit, but in this case it's actually to its detriment. Each platform, either some platforms focus on being the best at one thing, and some platforms focus on being pretty good at everything, right? And what I tend to encourage people to do is, again, find the platform that's the best at the thing that you're trying to do, and then use multiple platforms. So for example, for Ghost, I recommend them for blogging because I think they're the best at that. But I don't think they're the best for sending newsletters, because that's not what they were created to do, right? So there are platforms that are designed just to be ESPs. And if you are looking for that kind of functionality, if you're looking to be able to like send really, really dynamic flows, or have really segmented lists, or really beautifully designed emails, I haven't gone down super far into Ghost on the newsletter side, so it's possible they have some of this stuff, but I would guess that something like a ConvertKit would be much better for those things. So it's a matter of how much customizability do you need, and then how much or how little friction are you looking for. But I would say the ESP is something that, for the most part, if you find something in those, 5 to 10 platforms that most people have heard of, you're going to be fine. And just remember, the newsletter itself is living, whatever domain it lives on doesn't matter, because from an SEO perspective, like, no one is searching for your newsletter, right? Like, no one's searching for like your update of the day. They're searching for your articles. So you want to make sure the articles are on a domain and live and can benefit from SEO. The newsletter side doesn't matter as much because no one's searching for that. Okay. I'm going to move down to this question, which is curious for advice on setting up the site structure for a niche blog. Basic mistakes to avoid. Also, how critical is it to get the categories in user flow correct so you don't have to change it down the road? So I mentioned this in the blogging section before, but yes, setting up the right overall like blogging structure, whether it's your URLs or what platform you're on, is something that you should put thought into to begin with, because if anyone's ever gone through a content migration, they know how painful it can be. It's a lot more painful than, for example, migrating from one ESP to another, which relates to what I said prior, which is like, even if you chose an ESP to start with here, if you started with Ghost and it wasn't giving you what you wanted, you can always pivot to another one. When it comes to your blog, it does matter a little more, because again, you don't want to, I mean, a lot of the time you have to do this later, but you don't want to go through a migration where you're having a bunch of 401 redirects and you're changing the domain of your blog and all this stuff. So when it comes to a niche blog, first, if you can, you probably want to find a domain that actually is like highly keyword correlated to the thing that you're trying to rank for, or like the subset, the industry, which is why if you go to, like, if you search a kind of long tail query, a lot of the things ranking there will again be like, if you're looking for, this is a bad example, but like keto recipes, probably some of the things ranking there are like ketorecipes.com or ketofood.com, right? Because Google, again, is using that relevancy metric to find things, and the domain does matter. So it's not critical, but that's one thing to keep in mind. If you already have your domain, well, then you want to make sure that, yeah, you do have, this is true for not just niche blogs, you want to have a really, really clean URL structure so Google can crawl your site easily. So yes, you would probably think through first, am I going to have, as we talked about in a prior question, is it going to be like ketorecipes.com/blog or blog.ketorecipes.com? Both are fine. You make that decision. Then you want to think through the key categories that you're going to be writing about, right? So if it's keto recipes, I've never been on keto, but maybe you have like a specific kinds of recipes, or like, I don't know, other types of articles, weight loss articles, I'm not sure, but you would think through the different key categories. And in order to do this well, you can lean on, as we've talked about throughout the course, like some of the data that Google tells you. So if you go into, I'll just go into Ahrefs, and if I'm going to go into, for example, Keywords Explorer, and if I look up keto recipes in here, okay, so related terms, or actually, which part am I looking for? I think it's the section, related terms. Basically, if this loads, there's going to be a section here, which you can see this is what I'm looking for. Do you see the term groups in here? So if I'm creating a keto recipe site, instead of me dreaming up what the categories might be, I might actually just lean on Google to be like, oh, actually, Google's already kind of bundled this for me. So it seems like there's like different types, so like maybe like dinner, diet meals, friendly meals, like healthy meals, family meals. I don't know, this is just an example, and it's not the best one, but again, if you're going to take anything away from this kind of micro example, it's to like use the data that Google gives you, as I've talked about so many times. And so yes, as you're designing like the niche structure for your blog, you want to first think about, again, subdomain or not, then what are the key categories, and then you want to set up those folders, because that's how Google will crawl things, right? So Google will go to your site, and then at some point it'll go crawl your blog, and as it's crawling your blog, if you have everything under the same folder, it's going to be really hard for Google to crawl, and also hard for Google to prioritize what it should be crawling first, right? Like what's the most important thing. And then once you've set up the folders, you may want to, as you're submitting your site directory to Search Console, if you want to get like in the like more advanced part of SEO, you can prioritize certain types of content or certain categories or folders by you're literally telling Google like these things are more important than these things. But I would say if you're like just starting out with SEO, I wouldn't worry about that. And in fact, a lot of sites still don't do that. And so I don't think there's too many mistakes to avoid, other than just think about your site as like, imagine you're like presenting it to like a board of directors. You're not just gonna like throw a bunch of pieces of paper together and like hand it to them and be like, hey, comb through this and find like what's important, right? You're gonna like probably have like you're gonna think through like what sections are most important, like what does this all file under, and then you're gonna tell them like, hey, here's like a directory of what you should care about, and by the way, like, you know, you might even care more about this thing, and you might, you know, kind of ignore these things. And so that's what you're telling Google when you're kind of setting your site structure up. You're kind of telling Google what you should care about. And again, you're like helping them set the map for your site. So I would think about it more like that, where not to like way overthink it, but just like, okay, how can I set this up so it's kind of intuitive for even a machine to understand what I'm trying to achieve with this site. And then the user flow, I mean, user flow is just in general, like you just want your like site to be readable. And you can also help Google in the same way that like if you're setting up categories, like those categories should be, you know, browsable on that same page, because Google is not just going to take your site map as the map. It'll also, like anything that you link on a particular page is a potential avenue that Google will go to crawl, right? So that's why people talk about like link juice. That's not just external link juice, but internal link juice. You have a certain amount of link juice. And again, the more that you're linking to things like through your sitemap, that is what Google is going to interpret as something more important. So if internally you have a page that's linked one time on your site, and then simultaneously you have a page that's linked 5,000 times, Google is likely going to prioritize crawling that page, not just because you've linked to it more often, but again, because Google is literally crawling your site. It's going through different links, and so it has a higher likelihood of actually reaching that particular page. So that's something to keep in mind as you're designing your sitemap, is to also kind of reflect that similar, if not same map on your actual kind of like navigation of the page. Okay, I'm gonna move on unless anyone has a question related to those questions. Sounds like that was helpful. Okay, so this question, hi Steph, I'm a content manager at a SaaS startup. I'd like to build a content framework as well as one that aligns with the sales and dev team so I can create content in advance and be up to date with what's going on in their end. Right now, the content and dev team use Trello for task management, but on separate dashboards. We're working in silos and I always get release notes, there's updates last minute. Is there a framework / system you can recommend? I started using Notion, but I'm overwhelmed with where to start. Sounds like not so much a like a tool problem, although I could be wrong, but more so just like getting on the right cadence with those teams and setting the right expectations and just saying, hey, I need this by X date. You can use like Trello. I use Asana for a lot of things. Notion can work as well, where you can set the right reminders, and you can also like set alerts when things are like overdue. But it just sounds like, and let me know if I'm wrong, but it sounds like you're just like not getting things far enough in advance. And so I would just like sit down with them and be like, what do we have to do to make sure that I can get this? Like, you know, I don't know how many days you need it in advance, but like 5 days, 10 days, whatever it is, and just sit down with them and be like, what do we have to do to make this happen? We've done things like this in the past at The Hustle, and it just means that for sometimes I wouldn't recommend it over the holidays, but maybe like January 1st, you say like, okay, we're going to like grind for the next week so that we can get ahead. And then from there forward, you just have like a really, a more relaxed schedule in the sense that like you now have those 10 days for them to get back to you. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I have used Trello or Asana. One thing you can do as well is, I don't know how much you've automated those processes. So for example, whenever they've completed something right on their end, like does that automatically ping you and reassign you the task or vice versa? that might be something that's helpful if all those things are automated. But without knowing too much about like what's going wrong with your sales and dev team, it's a little hard for me to actually help in that case, assuming that you're talking just purely about like the logistics of the system. I'm not sure if this person is actually on the call. I think this one was added earlier, so hopefully they can follow up with me via email if they are still wondering. But yeah, did I miss anything? I guess it looks like I answered everything here. Feel free to add any final questions, go off mute, add in the chat if I missed anything. If not, we can, call this early because hopefully this was helpful to the questions or the people that had those questions. But yeah, I'll just wait another 30 seconds to see if there's anything else. If not, we'll end this early. All right, does not seem like it. I don't see anyone typing. So I'm going to call it early. If you have any questions after the fact, you know where to find me. Hopefully either DM me on Twitter or email hello@stephsmith.io. Hopefully you found this helpful. And yes, as I said, feel free to always ask any questions as they come up, also in the community, which I forgot to mention on Telegram. All right, thanks everyone. See ya. Happy holidays.